The Battle of Berlin, designated the Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation by the Soviet Union, was the final major offensive of the European theater of World War II. Following the Vistula-Oder Offensive of January to February 1945, the Red Army had temporarily halted on a line 60 kilometers east of Berlin. When the offensive resumed on 16 April, two Soviet fronts attacked Berlin from the east and south, while a third overran German forces positioned north of Berlin. The first offensive preparations at the outskirts of Berlin were made on 20 March, under the newly appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, General Gotthard Heinrici. Before the main battle in Berlin commenced, the Red Army encircled the city after successful battles of the Seelow Heights and Halb. During 20 April 1945, the 1st Belarusian Front led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov started shelling Berlin's city center, while Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front had pushed from the south through the last formations of Army Group Center. The German defenses were mainly led by Helmut Weidling. The units consisted of several depleted and disorganized Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions, along with poorly trained Volkssturm and Hitler Youth members. Within the next few days, the Red Army reached the city center, where close-quarters combat raged. Before the battle was over, German Führer Adolf Hitler and some of his followers committed suicide. The city's defenders surrendered on 2 May, but fighting continued to the northwest, west, and southwest of the city until the end of the war in Europe on 8 May, as German units fought westward so that they could surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. Background: starting on 12 January 1945, the Red Army began the Vistula-Oder offensive across the Nahe River and from Warsaw, a 3-day operation on a broad front, which incorporated 4 army fronts. On the 4th day, the Red Army broke out and started moving west up to 30 to 40 kilometers per day, taking East Prussia, Danzig, and Poznan, drawing up on a line 60 kilometers east of Berlin along the Oder River. The newly created Army Group Vistula, under the command of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, attempted a counterattack, but this had failed by 24 February. The Red Army then drove on to Pomerania, clearing the right bank of the Oder River, thereby reaching into Silesia. In the south, the siege of Budapest raged. 3 German attempts to relieve the encircled Hungarian capital city failed, and Budapest fell to the Soviets on 13 February. Adolf Hitler insisted on a counter-attack to recapture the Drau-Danube Triangle. The goal was to secure the oil region of Negritnaja and regain the Danube River for future operations. But the depleted German forces had been given an impossible task. By 16 March, the German Lake Balaton offensive had failed, and a counter-attack by the Red Army took back in 24 hours everything the Germans had taken 10 days to gain. On 30 March, the Soviets entered Austria, and in the Vienna offensive they captured Vienna on 13 April. Between June and September 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost more than 1 million men, and it lacked the fuel and armaments needed to operate effectively. On 12 April 1945, Hitler, who had earlier decided to remain in the city against the wishes of his advisers, heard the news that the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died. This briefly raised false hopes in the Führer bunker that there might yet be a falling out among the Allies and that Berlin would be saved at the last moment, as had happened once before when Berlin was threatened. No plans were made by the Western Allies to seize the city by a ground operation. the Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force. General Eisenhower lost interest in the race to Berlin and saw no further need to suffer casualties by attacking a city that would be in the Soviet sphere of influence after the war, envisioning excessive friendly fire if both armies attempted to occupy the city at once. The major Western Allied contribution to the battle was the bombing of Berlin during 1945. During 1945, the United States Army Air Forces launched a number of very large daytime raids on Berlin, and for 36 nights in succession, scores of RAF Mosquitoes bombed the German capital, ending on the night of 21 April 1945, just before the Soviets entered the city. Preparations. The Soviet offensive into central Germany, what later became East Germany, had two objectives. Stalin did not believe the Western Allies would hand over territory occupied by them in the post-war Soviet zone, so he began the offensive on a broad front and moved rapidly to meet the Western Allies as far west as possible. But the overriding objective was to capture Berlin. The two goals were complementary because possession of the zone could not be won quickly unless Berlin were taken. Another consideration was that Berlin itself held useful post-war strategic assets, including Adolf Hitler and the German atomic bomb program. On 6 March, Hitler appointed Lieutenant General Helmut Rehmann commander of the Berlin defense area, replacing Lieutenant General Bruno Ritter von Hohenschildt. On 20 March, General Gotthard Heinrici was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Vistula, replacing Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Heinrici was one of the best defensive tacticians in the German army, and he immediately started to lay defensive plans. Heinrici correctly assessed that the main Soviet thrust would be made over the Oder River and along the main east-west Autobahn. He decided not to try to defend the banks of the Oder with anything more than a light skirmishing screen. Instead, Heinrici arranged for engineers to fortify the Silo Heights, which overlooked the Oder River at the point where the Autobahn crossed them. This was some distance 17 kilometers west of the Oder and 90 kilometers east of Berlin. Heinrici thinned out the line in other areas to increase the manpower available to defend the heights. German engineers turned the Oder's floodplain, already saturated by the spring thaw, into a swamp by releasing the water from a reservoir upstream. Behind the plain on the plateau, the engineers built 3 belts of defensive emplacements reaching back towards the outskirts of Berlin. These lines consisted of anti-tank ditches, anti-tank gun emplacements, and an extensive network of trenches and bunkers. On 9 April, after a long resistance, Königsberg in East Prussia fell to the Red Army. This freed up Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front to move west to the east bank of the Oder River. Marshal Georgy Zhukov concentrated his First Belarusian Front, which had been deployed along the Oder River from Frankfurt in the south to the Baltic, into an area in front of the Silo Heights. The Second Belarusian Front moved into the positions being vacated by the First Belarusian Front north of the Silo Heights. While this redeployment was in progress, gaps were left in the lines, and the remnants of General Dietrich von Sorken's German II Army, which had been bottled up in a pocket near Danzig, managed to escape into the Vistula Delta. To the south, Marshal Konev shifted the main weight of the First Ukrainian Front out of Upper Silesia and northwest to the Neisse River. The 3 Soviet fronts had altogether 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,255 truck-mounted Katyusha rocket launchers, and 95,383 motor vehicles, many manufactured in the U.S. Battle of the Orionist. The sector in which most of the fighting in the overall offensive took place was the Silo Heights, the last major defensive line outside Berlin. The Battle of the Silo Heights, fought over 4 days from the 16th of April until the 19th of April, was one of the last pitched battles of World War II. Almost 1 million Red Army soldiers and more than 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces were deployed to break through the gates to Berlin, which were defended by about 100,000 German soldiers and 1,200 tanks and guns. The Soviet forces led by Zhukov broke through the defensive positions, having suffered about 20,000 casualties, while 12,000 German personnel were killed. During the 19th of April, the fourth day, the First Belarusian Front broke through the final line of the Silo Heights, and nothing but broken German formations lay between them and Berlin. The First Ukrainian Front, having captured Forst the day before, was fanning out into open country. One powerful thrust by Gordov's 3rd Guards Army and Ryborko's 3rd and Lelyushenko's 4th Guards tank armies were heading northeast towards Berlin, while other armies headed west towards a section of the United States Army's front line southwest of Berlin on the Elbe. With these advances, the Soviet forces drove a wedge between the German Army Group Vistula in the north and Army Group Center in the south. By the end of the day, the German Eastern Front line north of Frankfurt around Silo and to the south around Forst had ceased to exist. These breakthroughs allowed the two Soviet fronts to envelop the German Ninth Army in a large pocket west of Frankfurt. Attempts by the Ninth Army to break out to the west resulted in the Battle of Halb. The cost to the Soviet forces had been very high, with over 2,807 tanks lost between 1 and the 19th of April, including at least 727 at the Silo Heights. In the meantime, RAF Mosquitoes were conducting large tactical air raids against German positions inside Berlin on the nights of the 15th of April, the 17th of April, 18 April, the 19th of April, and the 20th of April. Encirclement of Berlin. On the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery of the First Belarusian Front began shelling Berlin and did not stop until the city surrendered. The weight of ordnance delivered by Soviet artillery during the battle was greater than the total tonnage dropped by Western Allied bombers on the city, while the First Belarusian Front advanced towards the east and northeast of the city. The First Ukrainian Front pushed through the last formations of the northern wing of Army Group Center and passed north of Jüterbog, well over halfway to the American front line on the river Elbe at Magdeburg. To the north between Stettin and Schwedt, the Second Belarusian Front attacked the northern flank of Army Group Vistula, held by Hasso von Manteuffel's 3 Panzer Army. The next day, Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army advanced nearly 50 kilometers north of Berlin and then attacked southwest of Wernukin. The Soviet plan was to encircle Berlin first and then envelop the IX Army. The command of the German 5th Corps, trapped with the IX Army north of Forst, passed from the IV Panzer Army to the IX Army. The Corps was still holding on to the Berlin-Cottbus highway front line. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner's Army Group Center launched a counter-offensive aimed at breaking through to Berlin from the south and making a successful initial incursion in the First Ukrainian Front region, engaging the 2nd Polish Army and elements of the Red Army's 52nd Army and 5th Guards Army. When the old southern flank of the IV Panzer Army had similar local successes counter-attacking north against the First Ukrainian Front, Hitler gave orders that showed his grasp of military reality was completely gone. He ordered the IX Army to hold Cottbus and set up a front facing west. Then they were to attack the Soviet columns advancing north. This would supposedly allow them to form a northern pincer that would meet the IV Panzer Army coming from the south and envelop the First Ukrainian Front before destroying it. They were to anticipate a southward attack by the III Panzer Army and be ready to be the southern arm of a pincer attack that would envelop First Belarusian Front, which would be destroyed by SS General Felix Steiner's army detachment advancing from north of Berlin. Later in the day, when Steiner explained that he did not have the divisions to do this, Heinrici made it clear to Hitler's staff that unless the IX army retreated immediately, it would be enveloped by the Soviets. He stressed that it was already too late for it to move northwest to Berlin and would have to retreat west. Heinrici went on to say that if Hitler did not allow it to move west, he would ask to be relieved of his command. On the 22nd of April 1945, at his afternoon situation conference, Hitler fell into a tearful rage when he understood that his plans of the day before were not going to be realized. He declared that the war was lost. He blamed the generals and announced that he would stay on in Berlin until the end and then kill himself. In an attempt to coax Hitler out of his rage, General Alfred Jodl speculated that General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, which was facing the Americans, could move to Berlin because the Americans, already on the Elbe River, were unlikely to move further east. This assumption was based on his viewing of the captured Eclipse documents which organized the partition of Germany among the Allies. Hitler immediately grasped the idea, and within hours Wenck was ordered to disengage from the Americans and move the 12th Army northeast to support Berlin. It was then realized that if the IX Army moved west, it could link up with the 12th Army. In the evening, Heinrici was given permission to make the link up. Elsewhere, the Second Belarusian Front had established a bridgehead 15 kilometers deep on the west bank of the Oder and was heavily engaged with the III Panzer Army. The IX Army had lost Cottbus and was being pressed from the east. A Soviet tank spearhead was on the Havel River to the east of Berlin, and another had at one point penetrated the inner defensive ring of Berlin. The capital was now within range of field artillery. A Soviet war correspondent, in the style of World War II Soviet journalism, gave the following account of an important event which took place on the 22nd of April 1945 at 8:30 local time. On the walls of the houses we saw Goebbels' appeals, hurriedly scrawled in white paint. Every German will defend his capital. We shall stop the Red Hordes at the walls of our Berlin. Just try and stop them. Steel pillboxes, barricades, mines, traps, suicide squads with grenades clutched in the hands, all were swept aside before the tidal wave. Drizzling rain began to fall. Near Bisdorf I saw batteries preparing to open fire. What are the targets? I asked the battery commander. Center of Berlin, Spree bridges, and the Northern and Stettin railway stations, he answered. Then came the tremendous words of command. Open fire on the capital of fascist Germany. I noted the time. It was exactly 8:30 a.m. on the 22nd of April. 96 shells fell in the center of Berlin in the course of a few minutes. On the 23rd of April 1945, the Soviet First Belarusian Front and First Ukrainian Front continued to tighten the encirclement, severing the last link between the German IX Army and the city. Elements of the First Ukrainian Front continued to move westward and started to engage the German 12th Army moving towards Berlin. On this same day, Hitler appointed General Helmut Weidling as the commander of the Berlin defense area, replacing Lieutenant General Raymond. Meanwhile, by the 24th of April 1945, elements of 1st Belarusian Front and 1st Ukrainian Front had completed the encirclement of the city. Within the next day, the 25th of April 1945, the Soviet investment of Berlin was consolidated, with leading Soviet units probing and penetrating the S-Bahn defensive ring. By the end of the day, it was clear that the German defense of the city could not do anything but temporarily delay the capture of the city by the Soviets, since the decisive stages of the battle had already been fought and lost by the Germans outside the city. By that time, Schörner's offensive, initially successful, had mostly been thwarted, although he did manage to inflict significant casualties on the opposing Polish and Soviet units, slowing down the progress